Our topic is trees and shrubs for the next 4 weeks, and you got some handouts tonight. The two that you got tonight are much better received as a printed brochure from publications than trying to download it at home. So that's why we provided those for you. There's one on lilacs, and there's one on selecting woody plants for fall color. And then in your level 1 training, in the publications binder, you should have received this one. So you should all have this one at home already. It's called Choosing the Right Landscape Plants, and it's this booklet format, and it should be under the landscape plants section of the publications binder that you got for level 1 training. While you're looking through your things, I would like you to also, whether you're looking for this or not, I'd like everybody to look and see if they have a copy of this. Apparently, they sold us the last 100. But as I said, we have 144 people in the class. They're not reprinting it until it's updated. So we want to make sure everybody who needs one gets one, but we don't have enough for everyone. The number is A3597, and the title is Woody Ornamentals Pest Management in Wisconsin. And because what I'm trying to do with this course really is to help you become as familiar as possible with the plants that you're going to have people ask you questions about and what their most common insect and disease problems are, as well as their common cultural problems. The insect and disease problems are addressed in here. And by looking in here, you can see for each of the species we're talking about what the most probable problem is. Probable problem. Got that. Because it's listed in here, it's a Wisconsin book. They even have a little mark next to the ones that are the most common and happen every year. And then the others are ones that might happen occasionally. It's very well laid out. I'd really encourage you when you get these to take a good look at how they're laid out and the ways you can find information in here. Because it is a book that has information about pesticides, but in amongst that, there's a lot of other information here if you know how to use it. So that's why we want to make sure everybody gets one of these. And we'll talk about them next week when we hand out the ones we have. Yes?
Sharon, when did that come out? Because I'm an 07. Was that format?
This has been around for a long time. We've had it continuously since I've been here. And I don't remember when this one was revised. It looks like it was, I don't know if this means 11 or 06, I think. Yeah, I bet it was 06.
Maybe a different
So are you saying
cover, or was it always that cover?
It's always been this cover.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure.
I have it.
And if you took level 1 training, in your publications binder, some years they gave it out in the publications binder, and some years they didn't.
I gotcha. That's why, because I know I don't have
The
that.
last 2 years, I know last year they did. So if you took training in 16, you have this at home. So check and make sure. If you took it in 15, I think they gave it out in 15 too. We also have handed it out at various and sundry other programs that we've run. So that's why I want all of you to kind of look through your materials and see if you've got it. Okay? I appreciate that. It's not because we're cheap, it's because they're just not printing them anymore. So that's all we can get.
I have to use it.
And we're cheap.
Right?
Okay. I also have some handouts that we've got quite a few of, but not enough for everybody. You've gotten these before, but it's a nice little publication about tree planting. And we had quite a few of them left over, and so we wanted to make them available to you. This is, first come, first serve. When they're gone, they're gone. So I'm just going to put those up here.
Does that
Yes?
have a number on it also?
No. No. Yes, Roger.
Could you put one online, so if you run out of them, we could download one?
I don't think we have this in electronic form. We'd have to scan it
That's what I
and
mean.
see if it
Yeah.
looks good enough. I don't know. Okay. And then I want to mention these books I have up on the table here. You know, you might wonder why I have any business talking to you about woody plants, but I do have a little bit of background in woody plants. My master's degree thesis was on large flowering shrubs for the Midwest. So, and this is my master's thesis. So I produced this book, and it is Stipes Publishing Company. Never does a good job with binding, so this one has fallen apart. But it's a great manual, lots of nice illustrations. And it was part of a series that my advisor was doing with his graduate students. So there are 4 more up here, and they are available through the U of I Cooperative Extension Service, their publications department. So if you're interested in getting these, they really have the tried and true, you know, plants that have been around for a long time. So, and also we did trees and shrubs as a short course in '07, I believe it was. And when I did that course, it was a once-a-month course, May, June, July, and August, the 4 sessions. And I created 51 plant pages. And each of them is on a different genus, species of plants. It has all the ID features down one side, and most of them on the back have some other like cultivar information or pictures of other cultivars of that plant. And these have been on the training materials website since '07. So they're there for you to print out. If you would like to print them out, print out just the ones you're interested in, however you want to do that. But I think they're very handy because largely because of this, the identification information that's on here, as well as the other information about the cultivar differences and things like that.
So what are they called?
When you look for them, I think they're called plant pages. I think they're on, so if you go to the SVWMG website and you go to the training page, and then from there, there's another like sub-page, training materials. And you go all the way to the bottom of that, training materials, and I don't know if it says Woody Short Course or Trees and Shrubs or something, but there's this whole list and it's all the plant names. And each one is a link to a PDF of these plant pages. Okay, so look for those if you have trouble finding them. Let me know next week and we'll get you straightened out. All right. Well, I think that takes care of everything on my little list. So I think we can get started. I'm hoping the color is good on this. It's,
That's good.
getting okay?
Yeah.
Maybe, let's see, I'm going to try that. Yeah, you can see well enough with that, right? Okay, good, and then it shows up pretty well. Yes. All right. So I chose this slide with this picture of this beautiful house and that beautiful, well-manicured landscape because to me it's a whole lot of little balls and things that have been shaved within an inch of their lives. There's not a lot of natural form in any of that. And if that's what you like, that's fine. You know, it's, you know, you have your choices of how you want to do things. But I think a lot of times people do it that way because they see it that way, and then that person does it because they saw it done that way, and then everybody does it that way, and there really are other ways to manage your landscape. But this session isn't really about managing your landscape. This session is more about the plants that everybody seems to have in their yards. I realize that there's just really a handful, well, okay, 2 handfuls, well, maybe 3 or 4 handfuls and a foot full of plants that everybody has in their yards. You know, some people have an odd, interesting thing sometimes, but most yards, as you go down the street, it's like, okay, another silver maple, okay, another linden, another burning bush, another one of these. You see the same stuff all over the place. And some of them are not great choices, but people choose them because that's what's being sold, and that's what they see in everybody else's landscape. And they care for them the way they're seeing other people care for them, especially the commercial landscape maintenance companies that do shear everything into a ball. Even if it's just a little stick with a stem over here, they shear it into a little ball. But some of them really are old reliables, and that's why they show up in our landscapes over and over again. And some plants you get even if you don't buy them. You get them by magic. They just show up in your yard. Volunteers. It's a whole different meaning for the word volunteer. I like these volunteers, not those volunteers, but you're absolutely right. But there are better choices. And on our 4th session, Laura Joe will come, and I've asked her to talk about the better choices. So I'm going to talk about the ones everybody has, the common stuff you see everywhere, and what their common problems are. And Laura then will talk about what other choices there are for you now. And I've told her to just choose things that we know we can get a hold of at the local nurseries, and maybe you'd have to go to a couple nurseries to find it, but available. So I think that will be a great course. But I do think that you all need to know as much of this stuff as you possibly can, because you need to be able to recognize them when somebody brings it in or brings you a picture of it. And then you also have to know what's normal, so that you know if it's looking normal or not. And if it's not looking normal, what's not normal about it, so that you can start to figure it out. And then by knowing some of the common problems it can have, you can start talking to people about where it's sited and what kind of exposure it has and how they've cared for it, knowing what kind of conditions it likes. So that's what we're going to try and go through tonight. There are some that are not the best selections, and one that we're going to see flowering relatively soon is the Bradford Calorie Pear. That's what that photo is of. I had never realized how many billions of them we have in Milwaukee, and I don't know why I hadn't noticed it, but suddenly they're everywhere, and you notice it when they're in full flower, and they are gorgeous, but they are becoming invasive, and they are not yet on the invasive species list. They are an introduced species, so they could become an invasive, be identified and put on the list. But they have all kinds of structural problems. So they look beautiful when they're in flower. Their leaves are pretty during the summer. They have a nice little fruit on them that doesn't cause any problems. But they have this structural problem where the branches are all way too close together. As those branches get wider, they run into each other, and next thing you know, some of them are dying because they're girdling each other. So they're not a great choice. Some of them, though, have problems that you can live with, and others are just plain old trash trees. So how we're going to discuss these things tonight is to look at trees and shrubs and whether they're deciduous or evergreen, and then kind of their sizes. We categorize them by shade trees and small ornamental trees. And with shrubs, deciduous shrubs, I have large and medium ones, and I kind of put them all together. And I don't have any small, because there really aren't any good small shrubs. And there are things that people buy because they're supposed to be small, and they don't stay small. They may be small relative to the other version of that plant that grows big, but it still is this big, and you want it to be that big. That's a huge problem with purchasing plants and not planning for the mature size. So there really are very few very small plants for a normal landscape-sized planting. So let's have a quick review of scientific nomenclature. The binomial system, there's genus and species. Genus is always capitalized. Species is not capitalized. And it's either italicized or it's underlined. And in my handout, I did neither, because it would have taken me so long to italicize all those things that I just didn't do it. And then there's cultivar. And the abbreviation for cultivar is CV period, or CVS for multiple cultivars. And cultivar is not italicized, always capitalized, and in single quotation marks. Then they now have these trademark names, where there will be a plant that's called, its trademark name is ballyhoo. Means nothing to us. But then their cultivar name will be autumn blaze. That makes sense. But that plant really has all those names. I'm glad that I wasn't taking woody plant classes these days, because you'd have to memorize all of those trade names and the cultivar names. And I don't know how the nurserymen keep it straight. Nursery industry keeps it straight. But there are also varieties and subspecies, so you'll see those notations sometimes too. And it has to do with how they arose, if they arose naturally or if they were part of a propagation process, and how different it is from the others, the species it came from, and what part of it is different. If it's the flower, it's probably a variety. If it's the color, it might be a subspecies. It really, really varies, so you just have to kind of know or take their word for it. But I keep going back to Carolus Linnaeus. He's certainly my mentor. He was 71 years old when he died, but in the 1700s, when he was doing his work and providing the names for both animals and plants in a systematic form, in the 1700s, probably by whale oil lamp with a quill pen, and he wrote something like 140 books on this stuff. It's all the man must have done in his 71 years, and we are still using those names by and large today. So he's a pretty incredible guy. All right, here we go. We're going to look at the common deciduous shade trees. Name some common deciduous shade trees you know. Maple, elm, ash, oaks, locust, birch, linden. Good. All right, well, we can go on to the next section now. So we're going to start with probably the very most common, the silver maple. I think it's because you can probably cut off a stick and put it in the ground and it will grow into a tree. Or you can just take some of the little helicopters and they seed themselves, and then you can just dig one of those up and go plant it somewhere else, and lo and behold, 15 years later you have a huge tree because it grows very, very fast. And it's called a silver maple because of the silver undersides on the leaves. The lobes are very sharp and deep. The helicopters are the type of fruit that all of the maples produce. Remember, those are called schizocarps. I just love that name. And they get huge. They can get to be 120 feet tall easily. Their trunks can become the size around of putting 5 people together, so you couldn't hug that tree without many people helping. But because they are very fast growing, they're also very weak wooded. And when plants are fast growing, as a general rule, that makes their wood very weak and breaks up very easily in storms. So if you have one, you might have noticed that you had a lot of branches falling down this last couple of days when we had all that wind. And then in a good ice storm, you'll probably lose several branches. And they don't have perfect crotch angles everywhere that make for nice strong branches, so they do, whole branches will break off. Those seeds become very messy, and it does seem that some years they produce many, many more seeds than other years. And the years where you've got tons of seeds, you're up cleaning your gutters out 2 or 3 times before it's all done. So they can become very messy for that reason. And they also attract box elder bugs. That's what box elder bugs eat, are these seeds. The adults also will eat some of the leaves, but not do very much damage to that. And they don't do any damage, really. I kind of hope they eat all the seeds, personally. And there's a little picture up here of the box elder bugs. And this is one of the bugs we're doing in the Backyard Bugs program for the State Fair display. The box elder bugs will be much, much, much more numerous in years where it's wet. Because, I'm sorry, the box elder bug will be much more numerous in years where it's dry. Okay? So in a dry year, there is no fungus to kill them off. In wet years, there's a fungus that grows and proliferates in those moist conditions that kills off a lot of the box elder bugs. So if it seems like some years there's lots of them and other years there are less of them, think about what the weather patterns have been like. And that's the reason that your populations are going to be so different. They have very quick growing roots that can clog drains, and they can also become very chlorotic. The picture right up here, chlorosis, remember, is a condition, it's a description of a symptom, and the symptom is that the veins are green and the blade of the leaf is yellow. And it's because the pH of the soil prevents the plant from taking up either the iron or the manganese that's in that soil. There may be plenty of iron and manganese there, but at higher pHs, it's not available to the plant. And in some settings, you'll find that silver maples are responding to that, and it's manganese that they're short of. It'd have to be a very extreme case to recommend treatment, and I don't even know what the treatment for applying more manganese would be. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to lower pH so that it would be more available. That's hard to do. The pests that they have include those leaf galls that you've probably seen before. These are called bladder galls. They're little green balls that are attached to the leaves. They're actually leaf tissue. And they turn reddish as the season goes along. There's another one called the spindle gall, and it's leaf tissue too, but this like little long skinny things that are sticking up all over the leaf. And then there's one called a felt gall. And early in the season, these patches are just kind of fuzzy and pale color, and then by the end of the season, that turns red. None of those cause any problem, but they disturb people when they see a lot of them on their plant. And especially if a lot of the leaves have so many that it's kind of curling the leaves up, they worry that that's damaging the plant. But it's not. We would never recommend any kind of treatment for that. So it's nothing to worry about. Anthracnose is another thing maples, silver maples get almost every single year. This is about the best photo I could find. It's just little patches of brown scattered around the leaves. Some years it's worse than others. Like a lot of our leaf spot diseases, it depends on whether it's been a cool, rainy spring or not, because that's when the fungus spores infect the leaf, and then the spots show up later. It too is never severe enough to cause any real damage. But people do get concerned about it, and they'll bring a branch in to you with leaves on it that have these brown spots. They're kind of brown patches. They're brown areas rather than actual spots, like you'd think of a circular spot. But by far the worst thing with all of our maples is verticillium wilt. And I'm sure that Brian Huddleston will talk more about verticillium wilt, but it can definitely kill many of our maples, the Norway maple being the most susceptible to it. One of the ways you diagnose for it is to cut open the stems and look for the brown areas inside. But I think Brian's going to talk to you about that, because next week Brian will be here to talk about all the diseases of these common plants, and he'll give you more information about each of those. The following week, Chris Williamson will be here, and he'll talk about all the insects that are common to these common plants. So then the final week, you'll learn what other plants we can grow. So I'm hoping this all works out well. And it's telling me my battery just died. Oh, it says it's dead, but I just got one more squeak out of it. Oh no. Well, we'll hope this works. All right, so Norway maple. We have thousands of Norway maples in the Milwaukee area alone. It is probably the most popular street tree and lawn tree for a shade tree. The leaves are, I get them confused a little bit with sugar maple. They have similar lobing. They're a little bit more kind of undulating, you know, where they kind of are wavy, not cut wavy, but kind of undulate and don't lay flat. They have these bright yellow flower clusters in the spring, and they're like chartreuse. And when they are flowering, you look around town, you see all these trees with this bright chartreuse on it. It really is pretty. It just looks so springy. Then they do produce those awful helicopters as well. They can have a brilliant yellow fall color, so they do have some redeeming value. And a lot of the ones we have in our area are cultivars that either start the year out with red foliage or end the year with red foliage. Some of them have red foliage all season long, and some have red foliage that's so dark red they look black. So the Crimson King is the one that has dark foliage almost all summer, looks almost black. Schwedler's is another cultivar that has it only in the spring and then it turns green in the summer. And also one called Deborah. And those were cultivars that are very common, so those are a lot of what was planted. So Crimson King and Royal Red are cultivars that stay red all summer long. And then columnari, I couldn't believe it when I came to this area because I saw so many upright Norway maples. I'd never seen that many of them before, and they're used on streets as street trees all over this area. And I personally think they're ugly, just really ugly. They just look real funny. Yes.
Is that what's at State Fair Park?
Yeah, they have them along the road. No, that sidewalk leading into the park that's in the parking lot, those are beech trees. They're purple-leafed beech trees. Upright purple-leaf beech, and they have to cost, I can't imagine how much they paid for those, because they're a very unusual plant, and they're very expensive. But they're very cool, and they're surviving quite nicely. Yeah. That was along the walkway going into State Fair from the corner of 84th and Greenfield. Those purple trees, they're amazing. Yeah, no, those are not Norway maples. So, you know, your general Norway maple looks like this. That's fall color on a lot of them, especially the ones that have red in them. Some of them will have a good red color, but the ones that have the darker red color usually get this kind of yellow, kind of a washed out yellow. And then this is a picture of the columnari, that are the upright ones. Royal Red on the left and Crimson King there on the right. You can see that it's almost black, it's so dark. And I'm sure you've all seen these. But that's why some of them look darker or redder than others, is that they're all different cultivars. The problems they have, the main one is that they produce such dense shade that it's really difficult to grow grass underneath them. That is until they get verticillium wilt and then they lose like all their leaves and branches, then they have lots of light coming through. So since you're not getting much light through, it's really, really hard to grow grass underneath them. And yes, the roots do kind of move upward, but more likely it's the fact that the soil is washing away because there's nothing to hold it that makes the roots become exposed like that. And so you're better off trying to get something on that soil to hold the soil down. Wood chip mulch is a great thing to put on them. You can put several inches on them and it won't hurt. You cannot put more dirt on them, and you cannot shave off the top portions that are above the ground. People ask that all the time. The other thing they're very prone to is girdling root. Now this picture only has one little root here that's starting to girdle. Other than that, it's got a pretty nice root flare, and that's what you look for. But many of these trees that you see on as street trees particularly will be what we call telephone pole trees. You know, they go straight into the ground. You can't see any flare whatsoever. And a lot of times the girdling roots will be visible above the surface of the soil. If it's not visible above the surface, you know it's there because the tree is going straight down into the ground. They're very sensitive to being planted too deep. And so that's kind of what they do when they're planted too deep. But even in a natural setting, they can still form girdling roots. And it has become invasive. It is not yet on the official invasive species list, but it has become invasive. They're finding them growing in natural areas. So that seed is being transported around, probably by birds and squirrels and deer and such. The past verticillium wilt, as I said, is this is the most common species to get verticillium wilt. And then also tar spot. It's not really a problem for the tree. Everybody has seen this on the trees in the area for the last few years. And it too is one that has kind of, the population of the fungus builds and builds and builds, so you'll have it for several years and then it crashes. So I think in the next few years we probably won't have tar spot on everything. But we thought the first year was going to be an unusual year when we go back to normal, but even the specialists were a little surprised that we have so much of it. And it just kind of started 4 or 5 years ago probably. We didn't have it much before that. I mean, it existed in other areas, but not around here. But it doesn't cause any harm to the plants. It just looks kind of yucky. And then the sugar maple. Sugar maple is the state tree of Wisconsin. It was also the state tree of Illinois, which is where I was born. And then we moved to Connecticut, and it was the state tree of Connecticut. They're following me. No, I don't think so. They have that beautiful Canadian maple leaf shape for the leaves, kind of an upright oval plant, and of course, spectacular fall color. They do produce seeds. Seemingly, it doesn't seem like they produce as many as the other species of maple. And we grow them for that beautiful fall color they can get. The main problem is that they're not real urban tolerant. So compacted soil and wet, heavy soils and any kind of traffic near their root zones can cause problems with them, even more so than pollution. But in areas like cities where they have a lot of pollution, air pollution, they don't tolerate that very well either. So it's that root zone that they really need to have a little bit better soil, a little bit more forest-like, with more mulch, more organic material in it. So a good thing to mulch the area around the root zone of a sugar maple to keep it happy. But other than that, there are really no serious pests of sugar maple. Red maple, the nursery people must absolutely love red maple in this area because people keep buying it over and over again because it keeps dying. It's still an incredibly popular plant. I think it's that people don't notice that their neighbor's one died, and they go to the nursery and they're looking around and they go, oh, isn't that a beautiful tree? Look at that silver bark, and those leaves are a gorgeous color, and oh, we've got to have one of those. And then they plant it and they find that its biggest problem is alkaline soil-induced chlorosis. So that is the main problem they have. The leaves become extremely chlorotic, and the tree will look that color. It's not supposed to look that color. It's supposed to be a nice dark green. And it's suffering because it's not getting enough iron. And treating it helps a little bit, but it's hard to do, and to do it for year after year after year. So people grow it in this area. They try and grow it in this area because it tolerates wet soil so well. And with heavy clay soils, our soil does stay wet. In areas of our yards, we all have an area that's kind of wetter than the rest of the yard. And you think, oh, red maples, they grow in the swamps, so let's plant it there. But not in our alkaline soils. We can't grow that one very well. So, and as I say, it doesn't live long enough to have other problems. Okay, any questions about the maples? Back there first.
How about the hybrid Freeman eye?
It's not one we're seeing in everybody's yard yet, but we're seeing a lot of them. And I'm assuming that Laura Jull will talk about the Freeman maple. And you had a question too.
On the heavy shade maples, can they be pruned a little bit thinner
Yes.
to keep the funguses from overtaking the whole tree? Such as
No, the fungus doesn't form on the tree because, well, the tar spot, but that's just a few years thing. When they produce a lot of shade, it's a problem with growing grass underneath them. So that's the Norway maple that does that. And yes, one way to solve that problem is to have the tree pruned so it's thinner in the canopy and lets more light through. But that's kind of a short-term fix and kind of a drastic fix too, and an expensive fix if you have a big Norway and you call in an arborist to do it. So not very many people opt for that. If we tell them that's an option, they go, I'm not doing that. So we tell them to put mulch on the soil to keep it from running off. Okay, ash. Nobody's planting ash now. But we sure have a lot of ash in the area. It seems like we're going to have more ash than we need for a very, very long time. But the emerald ash borer has made sure that that's not going to happen. Because all of our species of ash are susceptible to the emerald ash borer. It was used as a very reliable plant because it was so quick, fast growing that for the nursery industry, it was a great plant. You could grow it into a good sized specimen in just a few years. And then they perform okay in the landscape, but they really have a whole bunch of problems. And as you look around, once you can recognize ash from a distance as you drive around, it's like, oh my gosh, these ash trees, they're like half fallen apart, and people have left them in their yards, and because it's expensive to cut them down, and a branch will have fallen out, and one's got dead leaves on it, and just all sorts of unattractive things about them, and they're hard to get rid of once you have them. When they're younger and still in pretty good shape, they are very attractive. They do have pinnately compound leaves. So that's one way to tell them, is that this entire thing is the leaf, and it has 5 leaflets. So it can have 5 to 7, 5 to 9 leaflets. And whenever it's an odd number like that, it means that you have 1 at the end and then in ranks of 2s. If it's an even number of leaflets, then they're ranked 2 by 2 down the stem. A very shiny, glossy green. The male flowers look like this. They're kind of little hard, they're kind of yellowish with a little bit of red in them when they're fresh and new, but then they dry down and stay on the plant. They will fall off if they haven't gotten the ash male flower gall, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And then the female produces all of these seeds. Thousands and thousands and thousands of seeds. But they don't seem to fall off and clog your gutters and all that as often or as bad as the maples do. I think they don't, I think the helicopters can catch in the wind and be blown more easily than the ash, which is, they're single. They're like half of a schizocarp. So they're just a carp. Yes.
Only the females make those seeds?
Yes. Yep. But the problem is they're very adaptable to different soils, and they can tolerate our wet soils and our compacted soils. But the problems they have are numerous. Ash decline is something that they have kind of called sort of a condition that's an accumulation of stresses on the plant. It leaves out late in the year. It loses its foliage early in the year. It's kind of sensitive to frost. It has all these insect problems. It has all these disease problems. And put all that together, and just all the stresses kind of take their toll on the tree, and it dies. Not any one thing killed it. It just all kind of accumulated. That was what they called ash decline. They do also have this phenomenon where they drop a bunch of leaves in early June. You may have noticed that all over your lawn, all of a sudden, you'll have all these ash leaves. The tree looks fine. The leaves that fell look fine. And what they finally decided that is the tree just kind of jettisoning the leaves that it can't sustain anymore. It's gotten fully leafed out, spring is over, and now it just kind of gives up some of its leaves. Because there's no other explanation. There's no disease that's causing that. There's no environmental conditions that are causing it. It happens all the time without damaging the plant. The plant's still full of leaves. So, but that leaf drop, you'll hear people ask you, my ash is losing leaves. I see these leaves all over the ground, whole leaves, And that's the phenomenon they're talking about. We know about emerald ash borer, and I'm sure Chris will tell you a lot more about emerald ash borer. Great picture over there, because it shows you the insect and the hole that it leaves as it emerges from the inside of the tree. There's also ash plant bug. I could swear I had a picture of ash. Oh, I do. Okay. Ash plant bug, ash plant hopper, the male flower gall, we'll talk about that, anthracnose, and ash yellows. All of those things are very common. They're not just sometimes. They're very common. Most years they have many of those. So ash anthracnose is here on the left. It doesn't really hurt the plant that much, but it makes the leaves look really ratty and tattered. So it's got all those brown spots all over the leaves and causes the leaves to kind of curl funny. This is ash plant bug, and this is pretty pronounced and pretty extreme with all the little tiny yellow dots. It's where the insect has put its mouth parts into the leaf and sucked out the plant juice, sucked out the sap in there, and it leaves this little yellow spot. Sometimes you'll just see little tiny bits, a couple little stipples on a leaf and a couple little stipples here, and you know there have been some ash plant bugs there. But if you have it this extreme, that is kind of sapping the tree of its energy. And they have that almost every year. The other way to tell if it's ash plant bug is to take a cutting, and as soon as you know, a little piece of the branch like this, and as soon as you're holding it in your hand, you will feel something crawling on your arm, and then you know you have ash plant bug. They always do that. And then this is what the male flowers do when they get a gall that's caused by an insect that infests the male flowers. So the male flowers themselves would just brown and dry and they'd fall off the plant. But if they get the gall is hard, dark brown, big clusters of them, and then it hangs on the plant for quite a long time. So it can be really unsightly. So you try and avoid having male flowers or having male plants. So the Marshall seedless ash has fewer male flowers. It's a male plant, so it doesn't have any seeds, but it also doesn't have as many flowers, of male flowers, so it doesn't get as many male flowers on the tree to get the ash plant, the ash gall. And I could swear I had a picture of, oh, maybe it's with the white ash. It is. Okay. Okay, so on to the white ash. This is the other one of the two ashes that are most common all over the place in Milwaukee and really a lot of urban areas. Pinnately compound, 7 stalked leaves. You see that the leaves on these actually each have a little stalk holding them onto the, whereas the other ones were right up against the stem. So it's a good way to tell them apart. They have good fall color, and I'll show you a picture of that. Autumn purple is one of the cultivars that is seedless, which is a nice thing. And it has a gorgeous fall color, and you can tell it from every other tree in the fall because the outer edges of it are all purple, and the inside just glows yellow. It's just gorgeous. And they're very adaptable, but they still get all the same problems that green ash gets. But this is an autumn purple white ash, and that picture's too dark. Sorry, you can't really see it that well. All right, somebody said locust. This is honey locust. And I know that's what you were thinking when you said locust, but locust is really Robinia, that's the genus, and this is Gleditsia, so it's the honey locust. They're two completely different genera. And locust, the black locust, Robinia, is an invasive species. It is now officially on the invasive species list. It really, really spreads, and you can see that along the expressway is where I see it as I'm driving to work on the banks. You'll see all these huge trees that have white flowers hanging off of them, and oh, they probably do it in late May, mid-May. It's kind of a dangling cluster of flowers. But that's not the tree we're talking about here. This is honey locust. It too is a very popular shade tree and street tree. And part of the reason is that it is very adaptable to a lot of situations. It grows pretty well in our area. But also because of the fine leaves, it has really tiny little leaflets on its doubly pinnately compound leaf, that it has a lighter shade. So there's not very much shade underneath it, just enough to give you some relief from the sun. But it also then is a fine textured plant, so it's different than all the other shade trees. It does get a nice yellow fall color, and it has male flowers on it, female flowers on it, and perfect flowers. Remember what perfect flowers are? They have both the male and the female together in one flower. So it has all of those on one plant. And the females, of course, are the ones that produce those big brown pods that can become very difficult to deal with. So they did develop many years ago some fruitless cultivars. Moraine, Shade Master, Green Glory are three of those. But we are finding that some of those then, as they age and get quite old, they start producing more pods again. So their stems are kind of zigzaggy, and even when they're a tree when the leaves are off the tree, even the larger branches kind of do this zigzagging thing. So they're kind of irregular, but zigzagged. So it makes them quite distinctive. And here's the zigzagging on a small stem, and here's a tree where you can sort of see some of the zigzagging, but you can definitely see the pods and the fall color. And this is the honey locust plant bug. It damages the leaves enough that they get crinkled very badly, but then also the plant bug itself is producing honeydew that then it's kind of a sticky, sugary solution that comes out the back end of the animal, the insect, and it gets on all the other leaves, and then a sooty mold forms in that. Or if you have your car parked under this tree, or if you have your picnic table or your lawn furniture under this tree. All it really takes is insecticidal soap or a good blast of water a few times, and you can knock off enough of them. We have had one year, I remember, that almost every honey locust in town lost all of its leaves to the plant bug early in the season. And you know, everybody thought, oh my gosh, it's going to die, it has no leaves on it now. But trees do have secondary buds that will leaf out if all the leaves are lost from a frost or from some insect invasion. They will leaf out again, and sure enough, they did. They also get nectaria canker. And I think, gosh darn it, I thought I had a picture of that in here too. But nectaria canker, it can definitely kill it. Nothing you can do about it, nothing you can do to prevent it. It forms a great big wound on the side of the trunk. It sort of is a bullseye thing because it infects and kills portions of the tree, and then that heals up. But I guess on the larger spot. And then it goes into the smaller and gets smaller and smaller. I don't know, it gets bigger and bigger. It must get bigger and bigger. So you'll see sort of these rings of wound tissue that's healed. You know how it has that rounded tissue? That's nectaria canker. And it definitely will kill them. Little leaf linden. And this is probably one of the only shade trees that I feel good recommending to anybody because it has very few problems. It does have heart-shaped leaves, which are kind of nice, kind of silvery underneath, a little bit lighter underneath at least. The silver linden has very silvery leaves underneath. They can have a good yellow fall color. They also have these pretty flower clusters, and each of these flower clusters has a little papery bract that is above the flower cluster. So it makes it very interesting and very attractive. They're pleasantly fragrant, and they are produced in June. They do attract bees, so some people are really opposed to them for that reason. If you have an allergy to bees, a real allergy to bees, I can understand why you would be, because they really do attract bees. But it's only while the flowers are in flower, and then they're done. And they will adapt to almost anything except dry conditions, and they have this beautiful formal teardrop shape. And even in the winter, without their leaves, you can see the branches form this beautiful teardrop. And in the summer, it's very obvious. And even ones that don't look like they're doing so well, or maybe had a branch break and so they're not quite as even, you can still see that teardrop shape, and then you know it's a linden. The bees can be a problem, as I said, but Japanese beetles absolutely love linden. Linden and birch are their two favorite trees. And especially on the golf courses, because that grass is so lush, and that's where Japanese beetles like to lay their eggs. They have so many Japanese beetles, and they also have linden shade trees on the golf courses. This whole top of the tree is brown. And you can like look across a golf course and you'll see all these little trees, you know, all the way out. You'll see these teardrop trees that are all brown. It's Japanese beetle. Yeah.
Is this the one that Milwaukee is planting, and I've got a linden tree?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, they have planted a lot of linden trees in Milwaukee and have for years and years and years. And there's no reason not to. It's not as severe a problem on home properties as it is on a golf course, but it still can happen. They are still somewhat weakened by it, and you can treat it with a systemic that goes up into the tree, and when they feed on the leaves, it kills them. Somebody had their hand up over here.
Oh, I was just gonna ask you if it kills the tree.
No, they don't kill the tree. But they do sometimes get aphids, and aphids are like the plant bugs. They secrete honeydew, and then that becomes sooty mold, and these leaves, it's a little hard to see in the picture, but they're all blackened on the upper surfaces of the leaves because of that honeydew and the sooty mold that forms in it. Yes?
I have a, if you remember last summer, I had brought in the leaves with a spindle bow on it. There was the green spore linden. Do those get that too?
That had what on it?
The spindle gall. Do you remember in one of the
Spindle gall?
classes, I brought in the leaves of the green spore linden and it had spindle gall in it.
I don't remember that. Because usually I don't see them on linden, but they could be. They do get a felt gall, and it's purple on linden. Kind of cool.
I'll bring you some.
Thank you. I'll try and remember it this time. Okay, and then the birches. Oh, question back there.
Do they commonly get their roots get exposed?
On linden? No, not like the Norway maple. No, not that I know of. They do produce a pretty dense shade, so I guess it's possible, but I've not noticed that with linden. Anybody have lindens? You noticed exposed roots? Yeah, you have, huh?
It's at the Fullerton, there are certain trees that have the exposed roots, so we would cover them with mulch.
Okay, yes, that's a good way to handle that. Rather than trying to plant grass again underneath it, it may be because of the shade. So the birches, you know, everybody wants that white bark birch that's the north woodsy feeling, and they want it as a specimen tree in their front yard. And unfortunately, birches want to grow at the edge of a forest along a nice stream bank with a little bit of shade, and then what do? We take them, we put them in the middle of our yards with full blazing sun, and have them compete with the grass for water, and you know, it's the worst situation for them. So paper birch is something that's almost impossible to grow well for very long in this area. But they are a beautiful tree, and that bark is what we're growing it for. And it has the problem of being intolerant of the hot, dry sites in full sun, and so this is what they usually end up looking like. And when you have multiple stems, you know, multiple trunks, that can make both of those compete with each other because they're next to each other. As they both grow in width, they grow into each other. They don't really connect. They're just pressed up against each other. As they get taller, the weight is always at the top, and they can easily fall apart. So as pretty as a multi-stemmed birch is, or any tree, it really is not a real structurally strong situation for them. But the main reasons why we can't, the secondary, I guess, main reason is that we have several insect problems with birches. Whether it's a river birch, which they suggest instead of a paper birch, but they all have two of the three. Bronze birch borer and leaf miner and iron chlorosis. So the bronze birch borer, if you can see this zigzaggy line going up here, that's where the larva is feeding underneath the bark. And the bark is so thin that you can actually see the raised, it's like a little mole going through your yard, you know? It's going through the trunk that way. Now, you don't always see that, but you can see it in many cases. And then leaf miner is a little insect the egg is laid on the leaf, and when the leaf is very young and very soft and tender, the egg hatches, the larva burrows inside and gets right in between the upper layer of leaf and the lower layer of leaf, and it eats out all that nice tender tissue in between, and the two layers of leaf turn papery brown and thin, and it kills that portion. And if you hold it up to the light, you can usually see little black dots inside of there. That's their poop. And a lot of times you can see the little insects in there too. Those are leaf miners. And some years they're very bad and damage a lot of the leaves on the tree. So that stresses the tree out if it happens year after year after year. So it can be treated. And I don't know if Dr. Williamson will talk about that or not. And then chlorosis, again, the green veins and yellow leaf blades. And put them all together and it spells dead birch. Yes.
Mine has chlorosis. I shouldn't bother with it.
You just let them die? Yeah, it's very hard to cure that chlorosis or treat the chlorosis. River birch was suggested instead of the white birch because it is resistant to bronze birch borer. And that is a big killer of birch, very definitely. But it also has birch minor and iron chlorosis. So, and it doesn't have the pretty white bark, instead it has this peely kind of cinnamon colored bark. That's very pretty on younger plants, and then as the stems get older, they get more of a gray bark that's more like a normal trunk, tree trunk.
Still peels.
It still peels at that stage?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sharon, I have river birch and had red spots on the leaves. What would that be?
Red spots? Those could be a gall. There is a felt gall of birch too. And I do think it's on the top of the leaf, whereas many of the felt galls are on the underside. I think with birch, and it's red on birch, so I bet that's what it is. It doesn't cause any problem for the tree. Okay, yes?
On the paper birch, how detrimental is it if you strip large chunks of the bark off?
I don't think it hurts it at all.
Well, that was interesting because on a fooding program on PBS, they showed the Native Americans cooking a fish that they caught, and they wrapped it, they went up to the tree, ripped cut a large chunk of bark off and wrapped it around the fish.
I think that part is not, it's definitely not attached to the cambium layer underneath, and so it's really not doing any harm. I guess if you stripped a lot of it off, you may make it more sensitive to winter extreme temperatures, so that the cambium underneath it could get too cold and die. There are some trees that have that happen, but I've never really heard of it as a problem with birch, but I don't know. Yes?
Is the river birch more sun tolerant?
More what?
Sun tolerant? Does it take a full sun better than?
Yes, well, it can tolerate more sun, yes. But it does definitely like to live in the, at the river's edge with other trees near it. So it'll do fine in shade too.
I'll let you know.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
What is the yellow birch?
It's funny you should ask that, because I was just thinking about that. Out in Connecticut, we had a lot of yellow birch, and we don't have them here. And it took me a long time to figure out how to identify them. It's just another species of birch, and we don't have a lot of them in southern Wisconsin, at least, and I don't know if we have them in northern Wisconsin or not. They're supposed to have a wintergreen smell to the stems, as if you crush them, or you chomp on them, they're supposed to smell and taste like wintergreen. And that was one of the things you could use to identify a yellow birch. And then their bark is kind of yellowish, not as peely as the paper birch, doesn't have the dark lenticels like the paper birch does. I just find that today was the first time in a long time I thought about yellow birch. Then you asked me about it. Okay. Moving on to oak, red oak. I'm just going to talk about a red oak and a white oak because those are kind of the two different categories of oaks, and you can kind of divide all oaks into one or the other, the red oak group or the white oak group. Oaks are a very good shade tree. They are not as difficult to transplant as a general rule as is rumored. Everybody thinks of oaks have this big taproot and so they're impossible to transplant, but that's not really true. They have very lobed leaves and they're sharp pointed on the ends. And they all have different kinds of acorns, white ones and red ones. And you can tell by the size of the acorn that's showing, and the size and the shape and the fuzziness or fringing of the cap, which oak it is. That's one of the ways you tell them apart. And I never did get it all straight, but
And you still passed.
and they still let me out of college with a degree. You're right. And the way I identify red oaks versus any of the others in that family is that they have, if you look way up into the top of an old red oak, it has what I've heard somebody call ski trails. So it'll have these silvery lines, pairs of them, that are going up the stem, up the trunk, but pretty high up on younger branches at the top, younger part of the trunk at the top. So it's something to look for. They are very adaptable, but some of them don't like alkaline soil. Red oak does, pin oak definitely does not, and yet we have 3 pin oaks out here on the grounds that are gorgeous, and they've never had problems. I don't believe they treat them either. They've never had problems with chlorosis. They do transplant just fine, and they're a moderately fast grower. You can have problems with chlorosis on oaks, especially if there's been any kind of disturbance to the root systems. The root systems are very sensitive, and when you do any kind of construction, you should have the contractor protect the root system. And there are ways to do that by putting down a dense layer of wood chips and plywood boards to run their equipment over. And they should have, beams in between, so you're putting as little weight on the soil as you possibly can. You can try to avoid the trees as much as possible and put fencing around them, way around them, so the whole root zone is unaffected, because otherwise you will have problems. And you'll see it as this chlorosis to start with, and then branches will start to die out of the tree. And so many times people get a nice wooded lot and they want to save all the trees and sometimes even build a house around a tree or a driveway around the tree or the patio around the tree. And it doesn't happen the first year or 2 or 3 or 5, but eventually it starts to happen. And because it's so long from when the construction occurred, they don't think that it could be because of the construction. And sometimes with definitely with other plants too, you'll find when you're asking somebody about a plant they brought in for you to look at and evaluate, you'll find that if you start asking about, has there been any activity around the root zone? Have you had an addition put on your house, or did you get a new driveway, or did you have a garage put up or something? And but that was 5 years ago. Yeah, but that's what it was. That's what's doing it. And then oak wilt is the other thing that they're very, very susceptible to. Red oaks, much more susceptible than white oaks. Red oaks will die from oak wilt. White oaks will usually recover from oak wilt. And I imagine Brian will talk about that some too. But this is the picnic beetle that transports the sap that has the fungus in it. The tree will start to thin out, and then when the leaves fall on the ground, they're flat, they look fine, they haven't curled up and crumpled or anything, but there'll be big patches of them that are kind of a bronzy color. And it happens in June, all at one time. A bunch of leaves will fall, and you'll know it's oak wilt. But you also look inside the stem for the brown cambium layer. The white oak has leaves that have rounded tips, and very, very large trees. They also have this tendency, one way you can tell them is that they get this fungus on their trunks that doesn't really hurt them. And if you were to look at the trunk, you would never think it was a fungus. But it makes the bark smoother, not as ridged, and kind of a lighter tan color. So you'll look at the whole trunk and you'll see these big patches of this lighter colored bark. And you'll know that that's the fungus, and so you can identify, that's a white oak. They prefer moist soil, slightly acidic soil, but they do tolerate a higher pH and dry conditions. They are a good tree for our area. Swamp white oak is probably even better because of the heavy clay soil. They tolerate wetter soil and heavier soil. So that's kind of been the landscapers and the nurseryman's choice for shade trees now is swamp oak, swamp white oak. Again, sensitive to construction. They are a little bit more difficult to transplant because of a taproot, so you do it when they're young, but you also get it from a nursery where they've done a lot of root pruning. And what they do is, they don't go by hand on every single plant. They have machines that they run down the row, cutting into the soil, which cuts the roots, which makes them branch inside of their root zone, and then they don't form a taproot, and they end up with a root that looks like this, a root mass that looks like that instead. And then that's much easier to transplant. When you dig it and take it out of the nursery, you're taking all of its roots. You're not leaving a whole bunch behind. They do root pruning on a lot of plants, but especially things with taproots. And it is susceptible to oak wilt, but they often recover. And then I thought I'd throw in this weeping willow just because in my neighborhood we've got tons of them. We've got a low area at the end of our block, and so that's where a lot of these are. We all know what weeping willows look like, but do any of you have weeping willows? A couple of you. Would you rather not have a weeping willow? Yes. Yeah, they're so beautiful, but they're nice to look at on somebody else's property. They're really, really messy. They drop all these little stems, these little whips. They're dropping constantly. Yeah, they're really messy. And then they're very weak-wooded too, and they fall apart in storms, and they drop leaves, and yeah, they're just, yeah, they're... So these are what the flowers look like. And then I heard once that in phenology, the first sign of spring to look for is that the willows start to turn golden. And you can look out across an area with trees in it and you see this golden color. You know, that's the first sign of spring. And, you know, grandmother willow and all that good stuff. And they have kind of that tufting appearance that hangs down. It's either like a snuffleupagus or a truffula tree. I don't know which one. But not a great plant to plant. And that's relatively short-lived because of all that. And cankers. They get cankers and wilts. They have several of those kind of diseases that make it very difficult. All right. So let's look at the small trees now, starting with our crabapple. We're fortunate, yes. Yeah. You'll see that at the very end of the presentation. So the big thing with flowering crabs is there are thousands of varieties, thousands to choose from, any color of flower, any color of fruit, any combination of the two. Flowers that open one color and turn another color, upright, weeping, rounded, everything. Tiny, teeny weeny, the Tina, Sargent's crab is just a little teeny weeny thing. So you have all those choices, but if it's not disease resistant, don't do it. And if you have one that's not disease resistant, and it's always giving apple scab every single year, off with its head, you know, cut it down and get rid of it, and plant something better. And it will grow up to a nice little tree in just a couple years. You won't miss that. You know, a lot of people say, oh, I don't have that much time. I can't plant a new tree. You're planting it for the next generation. But you're also saving yourself from all of that mess. And this is rust on these leaves. This is apple scab, and this is fire blight. So those are the big three on crab apples and apples, and they have bred extensively for decades crab apples that are resistant to all three of them. So you can get good crabs that don't do that all the time. So really, if you're buying a new one, definitely buy one that's resistant to all of those things. They also have bred for persistent fruit, because the fruit can be very messy if it's anywhere near a sidewalk or a patio or a driveway, if it falls off the tree while it's still soft and juicy. So they've made them so that many of the trees now have fruit that persists through the winter and will still be there when the new leaves are coming out the next spring. So that's definitely a feature that they promote. And root suckers, they also get root
It
suckers.
makes the robins really happy.
Yeah.
And they will fall out of the tree.
Yes, that's
They are
true.
so drunk on those.
Because they ferment, the fruit ferments over the winter when it freezes and thaws and it gets warm. And it's both the cedar waxwings and robins that do it. They eat the fruit and then they fall out of the tree because they're drunk. And they really do. They really do. It really works that way. That's kind of fun. It's kind of worth having, just for that.
The tree where you can see it.
Yeah, right where you can see it, so you can watch that. The flowering plums and cherries, I think the Newport plum is one of the most common of those. Everybody wants this nice little tree that has purple foliage and pretty pink flowers. And you can see those on this, but the problem is that it's a cherry. And cherries have all kinds of problems. They are very short-lived because of these problems. One of the ones that's most visible is this black knot disease, and it's not that visible during the summer, but when the leaves fall off in the winter, you'll see these big honking things all over the tree. And each one of those produces spores, and the spores travel to other parts of the plant, and it just spreads and spreads and spreads. You can treat for it, but you have to treat for it and cut out old galls. And if you have it on every branch, you don't have a lot left after you've cut out all the galls. So once you get to that stage, it's just one cut, very low down is all it needs. And then it has another problem, which is a peach tree borer. There's the lesser peach tree borer, which is here. No, I think it's on this one. I'm sorry, I can't see them very well, and you can't either. There's down at the base of the trunk, I think, is the greater peach tree borer, bores into the stem, and then there's also another one called the lesser peach tree borer that bores in at an upper branch, like the first branch. Those are difficult to prevent, and once they've infested a tree, it's all over. There's also all kinds of bacterial cankers and bacterial diseases. And those, when there's a bacterial disease or any damage to it, but especially with bacterial diseases, it puts out this gummy ooze, and it really is called bacterial ooze. And it's filled with bacteria, and then the bacteria fly on the wind, and rain and go to other plants. So anything that's in the prunus family is susceptible to all of this. They have not really bred a lot for resistance to all of this. So it's something to be aware of, and most cherries and plums and almonds and things like that don't live very long because of all those problems. And then Japanese maple, everybody loves to grow a Japanese maple, and they are so gorgeous. And you go to a part of the country where they have the climate for them, and big specimens with these gorgeous layers and all these fine leaves that are, lobed and fringed and purple and red and orange and all this wonderful stuff. But we can't really grow Japanese maples in this area. You have to have a real microclimate for it, so you have to have a place where it's going to be protected in just the right way. So it doesn't get too much wind or sun in the winter and doesn't get too much exposure, and that helps to keep it a little warmer because they're not really hardy in this area. And yet people keep trying to plant them. You try a spot and see if it works. And sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. There here's some examples of some of them. There is one Japanese maple type plant, the Korean maple, that you can grow in this area. It is hardy in this area. It's called Acer pseudosibuldianum, and it has leaves that are, they're not as finely divided as the Japanese maple, and then they have a beautiful fall color. They're kind of tinged different colors in the spring, and then they have a beautiful fall color. They're plain green in the summer, but they could be a lovely little tree, and it's the only one that's really hardy in this area. Saucer magnolias, been around for years and years and years. They're a pretty big tree for a small tree. They're very coarse. Everything about them is coarse. The trunks are coarse, the flowers are coarse textured, the leaves are large and coarse. Yes?
Can you just go back to the maple? What are like the yellow or orange spots that you get these?
Out here, it's just pigmentation in the fall. On this particular plant, it doesn't happen on all of them.
Just like spots, like.
It's little patches that have more pigment than other areas. But those are probably completely green in the summer. Yes?
Yeah, I have a little one in my front yard, and the tips look like they dried. Is that?
A Japanese maple?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very common with Japanese maple. It's a scorch from just the sun. In the summer sun will cause the tips of the leaves and the edges of the leaves to turn brown. And not much you can do about it. Keep it well watered, mulch over the root zone. It should be in a location where it gets a little bit of shade. Question back there?
The scorched leaves that crinkle up like that, what do you do? Cut the leaves off, branch off?
No. It's just for this season. If it doesn't get as hot the next season, it may not do that. If it does it year after year, it's a pretty ugly plant. Go shopping. Find something else. Okay, let's move on to the saucer magnolia. As I said, everything is very coarse about it. Has silvery bark, usually branching kind of picturesquely. And the flowers are what it's grown for, and they look like tulips, pink on the outside and white on the inside as they open up, and they open up wide, so they're like a saucer. I guess that's why they call them that. And in the flower buds for next year form in the summer of this year, and the flower buds are big, fuzzy buds, so they're real easy to identify a magnolia because of those big those big fuzzy buds. And I thought you could see them in one of these pictures, but we're not seeing them. Oh, I guess on this one we were supposed to see them. These photos are a lot darker than they showed up on my computer. I'm sorry. Anyway, late spring frosts can kill the flower buds, and if they've started to open and they're killed, then they look sort of like somebody took toilet paper to your tree and it, got all wet and mushy, because that's exactly what the flowers have done. So they can get pretty ugly. It doesn't cause any real problem. It's just really unattractive. We had a winter a couple of years ago where magnolia trees, especially saucer magnolias all over town, lost in huge limbs, like one of those 3 big branches died completely, or 2 of them died completely. And it was from the extreme cold. It might have been 2012. I think that was the year we had that really horrible winter. And we lost a lot of crab apples that year too. I mean, we never lose crab apples to cold. But it's just a combination of things, because they're usually pretty cold hardy. Star magnolia is similar, but a lot smaller plant. And here you can see the fuzzy buds. There they are, fuzzy buds. Those are flower buds, so all of those will be flowers. And the saucer magnolia has those fuzzy flower buds too, as well as the star magnolia does. And you can see here how coarse these leaves are. And the saucer magnolia, because it's larger and everything about it's larger, those are larger leaves too. Bark is silver gray, like on the saucer magnolia, but a much smaller tree. I think maximum size might be 15 feet. A mature one might be 15 feet. And let's see, it opens a little bit earlier than the saucer magnolia, so it's really prone to spring frosts. There are a couple of other varieties that have been selected and they flower later in the season, have different colored flowers and are more flower bud hardy. But I'm not talking about the good plants tonight. And the flower itself makes a beautiful star. Yeah, there's a good example. They're beautiful when they flower, they really are. And they're very tolerant of most conditions, soil conditions and the alkaline soils and all that stuff, but their flower buds can be killed too. Service berries, I put this in here, it's not a bad plant to have in your yard, and you don't see it that commonly in people's yards, but there are quite a few of them out there. You see them a lot in commercial plantings, they're using them a lot in commercial plantings. People who know about them buy them and put them in their yards because they are a very nice little large shrub, small tree. And there are a couple of different species. I just chose this one. It can be a tree-formed service berry. And let's see, the flowers are one of the first things to open in the spring. And in the woods, if there are service berries in the woods, you look through the woods in early spring and all these little white flowered things are out there. That's service berry. And that happens before the leaves come out. And then the leaves, when they start to emerge, are a bronze color. And then they open up to this oval shape. And they have kind of a blue-green color to them. So it's a little different than other trees. They form these little clusters of berries. They start out red and then they turn purple. And apparently birds flock to them and you have a hard time getting to them before the birds eat them all. So they're not messy because the birds eat them all. And it's not like they eat them all and then stay there and do what you do after you've eaten something. So yes.
Are they a good replacement for buckthorn in under canopy areas?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. They would be a good replacement for buckthorn. And they have beautiful fall color. Lots of combined colors in there, red, orange, and yellow, all combined. They do prefer acid soil and very loamy soil. That's where they grow the best, but they will tolerate a lot of other soil conditions too, because we can grow them quite nicely in our area as well.
How tall will it get?
You know, I think it can get to probably 20 feet for a mature tree. And the stems can get quite large. And some of them are grown as a single stem tree that then has branches. It's trained that way. And some are grown with just a couple of multi-stem. And then others are grown as a shrub with lots of stems coming up.
Will deer eat
And
them?
what?
Will deer eat them?
Do they?
Yes.
Rabbits love them. Oh, you have to put something around them to keep the rabbits from eating them. That's good to know. Yeah. It's not one of the ones I hear about being. Oh no. Oh no. And they have very few problems except for the birds, and there is a rust that you'll see on them. But otherwise, they're pretty good plant. Oops, is that? Okay, let's just finish up these last couple and then we'll take a break. The pagoda dogwood. A nice sized pagoda dogwood that's healthy and in flower is a thing of beauty. They are just gorgeous. You'll notice that the scientific name is cornus, which is the dogwoods, and alternifolia. I spelled that wrong. I think I spelled it right on your sheets. It's Nifolia. And because they're the only dogwood that has alternate leaves. All the other dogwoods have opposites. This one has alternate leaves. So you can identify them pretty easily. If the leaves look like a dogwood, and it has alternate stems, alternate buds, then you know it's a pagoda dogwood. It also has very horizontal branching and very large, long branches at the bottom, and it forms branches in tiers at different levels, and that's what makes it look sort of like a pagoda. And the flowers, you can see when the leaves are fully emerged, and the whole tree is covered with those, and then the berries form, And they have the red stems that hold the purple fruits, and they are good for wildlife. So they're a very nice tree. And there's one in flower. I looked for the best picture I could find. But
They like a little bit of shade.
they do, you're right. Did I have that somewhere? Oh, here, it said preferred damp edge of wood sites, but they also thrive in full sun. I've seen them growing in full sun where they're even more vigorous. They're much denser in full sun. But they get this, golden canker. And it's almost to the point where we can't really grow them in this area without getting golden canker. Somebody have a nice, good pagoda dogwood that's still real healthy?
I've got two, one is really good and one is looking
Yeah.
brown.
This is what you're looking for, are these stems. And so if you notice an area of the tree that's lost some leaves, not looking real thrifty, it looks like it has a little dieback, look at it closely and you'll see the stems turn golden. And you see all the little dots on there, those little dots are all spores of fungus. Well, they're fruiting bodies of the fungus that produce the spores. And you can cut it back in those areas and cut those branches out. You're supposed to cut farther in toward the tree than where you see the damage. That's always the recommendation. Prune your, disinfest your pruning tools in between cuts and all of that. But it gets to a point where you've cut out so many large branches and then you'll notice it on the main trunk. And then it's kind of all over. So it's a real shame because they are just such wonderful plants. They're just gorgeous. Okay, let's take a break.